Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Mitch Tobin, and I'm going to be moderating this panel, and we're going to be covering some really fascinating innovations in water data that are helping inform decisions on how we manage water, and also providing new ways for journalists to report on this issue. It's really great for me to be back here in Arizona. My water journalism career began in earnest here way back in 1999 as a cub reporter for the Tucson Citizen, which is now no longer in existence. Then moved over to the Arizona Daily Star. And so it's been really nice to see some folks who I haven't connected with in a decade or two. If I look back 20 years to 1999, first of all, my head definitely had a lot fewer gray hairs, and Lake Powell and Lake Mead definitely had a lot more water in them. There have also been some major changes in the world as far as technology. When I think back to 1999, I got my first cell phone from the Tucson Citizen. It was about the size of a brick, and it required you to extract a little antenna to improve the reception. And so obviously things have changed really dramatically in that time. And certainly one of the biggest transformations is that we're now living in the age of big data, for better or worse. So today I live in Colorado, and as Russ was mentioning and we were discussing last night, the Water Desk is an effort that we're starting at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and our goal is to increase the power and the depth and the volume of water-related coverage with a focus on the Colorado River. So we're definitely grateful to the Walton Family Foundation for their support of this initiative. We're going to be based at the CU Center for Environmental Journalism. The director, Tom Muelsman, is here, so I wanted to give a shout out to him. He's been really instrumental in getting this initiative off the ground. We also have some of our journalism graduate students that we're working with who are joining us here for the conference. So just a quick summary of what the Water Desk will be doing before we move on to the panel. We're trying to strengthen water-related journalism in three main ways. First, by re-granting some of our funds to the field and supporting journalists and media outlets who are covering Western water issues in the Colorado River. Number two, by producing some of our own content, and one of the things we want to emphasize is data visualization. And number three, by working with CU students, helping train the next generation of water journalists, as well as engaging with the community through a series of town hall meetings and public engagement. We're just getting started. I've only been the director for a few weeks, so we'll be announcing opportunities to apply for funding soon, so please stay tuned. As I mentioned, one of the things we want to emphasize at the Water Desk is data, both in our own content as well as in the journalism that we support. So I must confess I'm a little bit of a data nerd. I really like maps and graphics, and I think data visualization has a tremendous potential in terms of telling stories related to water. I think data can point the way to both problems and solutions. As they say, what gets measured gets managed. Data can inject facts, not alternative facts, into complex and contentious public policy decisions. And data can allow reporters to do their own digging and break news and reveal untold stories. And I think data in and of itself is not necessarily very interesting in the digital format. It's just a stream of zeros and ones. But when you start analyzing it and visualizing it, I think there's a tremendous amount of potential to yield insights, both for water managers as they deal with critical decisions in the face of uncertainty, and certainly for journalists as they're trying to tell compelling stories about water. Now, I don't think data is a panacea, and of course there's always the other side, and certainly data raises issues, problems, challenges, even perils. As you know, when you mention data, many people think of privacy and who controls the data, who owns it. There is certainly the potential to misuse data, misrepresent it, either by accident, through ignorance, or intentionally through malfeasance. And I think as much as I love eye candy data visualizations, I think there's also the risk of getting so wrapped up with the data that we can be tempted to neglect some other aspects like the human dimension and the impact on real people. But on balance, however, I think data is very, very important for the water field and for journalism, and it's really essential for managing this precious natural resource. So with that, let me introduce our speakers for today. They're going to be sharing some of the innovative work that they're doing. To my left here is Jeffrey Allenby from the Chesapeake Conservancy. After that, Jessie Norriss from Upstream Tech is going to give her presentation. And then finally, George McCarthy from the Lincoln Institute. So with that, turn it over to Jeff for his presentation.
Clicker over here. I'm going to sit if that's all right. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine. So my name is Jeff Allenby. I'm the Director of Conservation Technology at the Chesapeake Conservancy. And I manage a team of now 12 geospatial experts, remote sensing experts, really focused on improving decision-making around conservation and restoration design using the latest and greatest technologies. Looking at it, see if this works. It may not. There we go. We are big advocates of the concept of precision conservation. And it was really interesting hearing some of the discussions yesterday. I believe it was Sean from California Coastkeeper talking about looking at the actual performance of best management practices compared to the modeled estimates and actually seeing some projects underperforming. And that really drove a lot of our work into some of the modeling I'll be talking about, is the fact that models are only as good as the data that you put into them. And a lot of models were developed to work at a watershed scale, but weren't really developed to operate at a project scale, a project-based scale. The data just wasn't there to be able to do that. And as a result, you have projects that are going to overperform the model, and you're going to have projects that underperform the model. And on average, they should be about what the model should say. So you're going to have some of those projects. And what we really wanted to say is, if we improve the data that we're working on, that the models are working on, can we identify just those high-performing projects and just those low-performing projects and start to incentivize people to work more on the side of the high-performing projects and move away some from the lower-performing projects that may have been convenient or you had a willing landowner. So we're really looking at trying to get the right practices in the right places at the right scale and making sure that it's working. In an ideal world, you would have field staff out working, walking every stream and river, talking with landowners. The reality is that's never going to happen. So what we've turned to is new remote sensing and digital technologies to be able to kind of create a digital replica of the world that much more represents that very fine scale, project scale work. Now, many of you may be wondering why the Chesapeake Conservancy is here for a panel on data and water in the West. It's a great question. And we operate as the Conservation Innovation Center when we're outside of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We got our start focused on the Chesapeake Bay, really focused on water quality issues. We're working with the Chesapeake Bay programs, the EPA-led partnership around restoration to improve data and modeling. And about 3 years ago, through some of our work with the Lincoln Institute, as the Babbitt Center was getting up and running, they said, hey, can you come out and look at potentially water quantity issues and see how some of the technology that you're developing in the Chesapeake could be reimagined, reapplied, because we're both looking at water. One is quality, one is quantity, but there's probably some lessons learned that we can look at between that. So over the last couple of years, we've been working on a series of pilots, starting out really focused on two different aspects, but driving down to get a better understanding of what's happening on the landscape and how that impacts water consumption and water use. So we've done a couple of pilots, one in Pima County, so down around Tucson, and one up in Denver we're currently working on creating this ultra-high resolution land cover data, 1 meter resolution land cover data. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other is starting to look at things like evapotranspiration and starting to quantify changes in water consumption based on development patterns over time and beginning to look at that. And both of those together can really help inform kind of differences in land management and how that impacts water resources. Looking at the high resolution land cover. So just as a quick frame, and I'm going to try not to go too deep on the technical side, but a lot of the land cover data, this is description of what's on the ground. Is it buildings, is it roads, is it agricultural fields? Was collected from Landsat. And this is a 30-meter resolution. Each pixel in the image represents about a 1/4 acre on the ground and classifies it as something. So it might be high intensity developed, or it might be agriculture, or it might be water or wetlands. And this was the standard for used in almost all modeling for the last 30, 40 years. And it's really great operating at that watershed scale. And you can see kind of in the bottom here, that's what part of Tucson looks like. It's kind of blobby, a little bit pixelated. What we're able to do is create a 1 meter resolution land cover data set using new imagery sources. So it has 900 times the amount of data. It allows you to be able to classify and pick out sidewalks and driveways as opposed to before just residential development. And all of those really, that fine scale data has a big impact on how you manage that landscape. Providing increased accountability to be able to say, are our programs actually having the impacts that we want them to have? Having the precision to be able to model and plan at that individual project scale that really wasn't available before. Really what we're starting to see both in the Chesapeake as well as some out in the Colorado River Basin is beginning to set your priorities differently. And not just going and saying this is a targeted watershed, but being able to impact how you're doing outreach to landowners to talk about the potential to do a project, how you're looking at evaluating the benefits of a potential project and moving from just measuring effort, how many acres are we doing or how many linear feet of stream are we restoring, to really getting into the measuring performance. What is the impact of that? And that's a really big shift in the way that managers think about measuring performance, going from effort to kind of the impact coming out of it. But what we're starting to see is it really benefiting a lot of different things, one of which is being able to give variable credit to a project and potentially incentive payments. So you can get a higher payment if you have a higher performing project, and kind of that pay for performance model is really bringing in some innovative financing mechanisms to be able to get projects in the ground, which weren't really available before. Just as another quick example, and I know we want to have a larger discussion looking at kind of the impact and being able to measure things like evapotranspiration. This is in the middle verde, just a little bit north of here. Being able to look at in the box, you can see kind of a golf course and a new housing development that was put in around 1999. By measuring that evapotranspiration rates and then looking statistically over that time period, what you can actually see is that increase in evapotranspiration from before 1999 to after 1999. That's the black line versus the red line. And at that point, you can really start to be able to quantify, kind of what the impacts and land use decisions are, and be able to have those conversations proactively to say what are some of the impacts of permitting a new development, or kind of what the impacts on water consumption are going to be. This is a small example. There's a lot of other really amazing research going on throughout the Colorado River Basin. I know Jesse's going to talk about some of the work that they're doing as well. But creating the ability to assess these really big data sets over time and be able to drive down to that project level is really opening up new avenues for management that didn't exist even 5 years ago. So it's really interesting to see where that's going. The other side of what we were working on, and I appreciate Russ's comments this morning about data. If you can't use that data, it's just a pretty picture. And what we really have focused on is creating the tools that allow managers and partners and landowners and stakeholders to be able to access this new information very easily and turn it into actionable information. So it's not just data, but what are the analysis tools that you need to transform it from its raw state into something that's actually usable for management. And we're working with partners, everyone from the federal government down to small two-person NGOs, to be able to get them access to this information in a format that works for them, that allows them to make decisions differently than they would have otherwise. Some is working with local partners just to get them technology. We're co-convening a new collaborative called the Water Data Collaborative that's focused on NGO and citizen science water data collection. How do you get this data in a machine-readable format that can be uploaded, that you can start to do visualization on? The map here, it may be a little hard to see. The blue dots are all citizen science NGO groups collecting water data. The orange dots and green dots are federal or state or tribal entities collecting it. And you can see that there's a lot more blue dots on there than there are orange dots. And the goal of this is to be able to say, how do you increase the network of people who are collecting information about water? And this is nationally. Obviously, this map is focused on the Colorado River. But building out that network of information to be able to come in and help validate some of the models and calibrate some of the models to be able to get better information out of that. The other aspect is looking at things that are more public facing. How do you create a website that's really easy for anyone to go type in their address and see what they can do on their property to restore water quality, water quantity, whatever it is. What we've really found is by making this accessible, we're bringing new partners in the door who are interested in doing the right thing on a voluntary basis. In the Chesapeake, we have the total maximum daily load around water quality. It's a really big stick that drives people to action. Out in Colorado, it's much more voluntary, so you have to think about it a lot differently. And what we're trying to do is make it as easy as possible for people to get the information that they need about what's going on in their land, what the impacts from their land are, and then connect them to the people who want to do something differently, whether it's a funder who has funding available to implement new practices, whether it's a restoration professional, but to really kind of shortcut that connection so there's as few barriers as possible for someone who wants to do the right thing to actually taking action, getting something in the ground. Very quick overview, but looking forward to more conversation. Jesse.
So I am Jesse Norriss, not Marshall, as is in your program, and I'm going to be talking to y'all today about our work at Upstream Tech, very complementary to Jeff's. So we are a public benefit corporation made up of about 12 or 13 people, a variety of water resource engineers and geographers like myself, and computer programmers that have background in data analytics to be able to process massive amounts of data. As a public benefit corporation, it gives us the flexibility to put our mission above profit and take on a lot of innovative projects in the environmental and water resource space. Okay. So Jeff briefly touched on the various satellites that are available, and I wanted to kind of do a primer on what those are and what that means. So there's about a dozen or so different satellites that have been orbiting the planet for the last several decades. And we at Upstream use a variety of different satellites from Landsat and the European Space Agency, as well as private satellites that have much higher resolution data and higher revisit. And the combination of all of that data allows us to understand different characteristics on the landscape at different frequencies. And the work that we do is providing kind of the bridge between all that data and then the machine learning to be able to analyze that in a meaningful way. So what is machine learning? At a high level, it's taking the remote data and ground truth data. So people that have gone to the ground, they're saying, this was pasture, this was crop, this was this type of crop, this was this water depth. Taking that and combining them and training a model to recognize those patterns over time so that you can continuously say, this is watered or dewatered stream reach, this is this type of crop or this type of tillage practice. And then recognizing that each time the satellite passes, it can understand the different changing characteristics on the landscape for continuous monitoring and measurement of your programs. And so what that looks like is often we get spreadsheets from folks that have collected the data, and then we can scale that by training these machine learning models to understand the landscape characteristics over time. So I'm going to walk through a couple of different examples. At Upstream, we work from agricultural assessments that are looking at, as I mentioned, what's happening in the agricultural space, as well as basin level optimizations and land cover change, as Jeff also mentioned, and then in environmental monitoring and understanding of easements and if you're paying for a program to happen, are you yielding the expected outcomes that you expected to see? And so for this, I'm going to talk specifically about our work in agricultural assessments and the ability to conduct large analysis in a very short amount of time to understand what has the history of agriculture been in this landscape and history of land use and water use. So starting at the very fine field scale is working with the National Fish and NIFWF. And they, I was like, what is that? I couldn't remember. Yes. So they have a mission of protecting endangered species in a variety of different landscapes, and we worked with them to be able to monitor if they are paying farmers to not irrigate to keep the water in stream in dry years. Is that actually happening? And they couldn't physically visit all of those different fields across a number of different states, so how can we train a model to be able to understand whether that is in compliance or out of compliance and adjust as needed throughout the growing season? On a little bit larger scale, working with the Iowa Soybean Association and being able to do a larger scale watershed assessment and understanding where is agriculture and riparian buffers and how then do we quantify what is happening on the upstream landscape to the downstream water quality implications. And then from their perspective, then being able to target where they do their outreach and implementation of programs. And then at a little bit larger of scale, we work with Target and the International Space Station in being able to understand where should we recommend different management practices in cotton across the world. So working both in Texas and the Indus River Basin, and saying what makes sense for a Texas farmer doesn't make sense for a North Carolina farmer, and how then do we give targeted recommendations and then be able to pay for the performance of certain management practices beyond just if it's organic or not. And then one other example that I wanted to walk through that I think is kind of relevant. This is probably more technical side of things, but we do a lot of work in understanding stream flow in ungaged basins. And if you have the understanding of the larger landscape, the snow water equivalent, the history of different practices on that landscape, how then can you understand what the stream flow might be? And using that in reservoir operations as well as the agricultural planning landscape and a variety of environmental flows, which y'all talked about yesterday, and being able to understand what is the base flow for the river systems beyond what humans need, and being able to account for that in water planning. And so similar to Jeff, we try to make this data available in a format that is accessible to a variety of different stakeholders beyond from the city planner to the NGO to the farmer in a web-based dashboard. Recognizing that not everyone needs a master's in geography, and in making those geospatial tools and analysis available to a variety of stakeholders. So this is just an example of one dashboard in an agricultural assessment we did in Washington. And that is all that I have for y'all today.
So my job is to actually tell you why this matters, especially for journalists. And one of the things that I think we need to kind of back up and think about is, it was really funny because one of the cognitive dissonance I had yesterday was that everybody talked about how emotional water issues are in the West. And everybody that stood up on this stage or sat up on this stage was so dispassionate that I was wondering, where's the emotion, right? But as it turns out, I mean, we do know that people take really deeply emotional positions about water. They take deeply emotional positions about land. And one of the things we also know is that there's no way that you confront emotional positions with data. Because people just don't want information to help them process emotions. They need something else. And as it turns out, if you take any courses in communications, Communications 101 will tell you that if you want to confront emotion, you confront emotion with stories. And you personalize it so people can actually understand from an emotional position what you're talking about. I'll give you an example in a minute. So then the question is, well, how does data help us tell better stories? Not how does data help us convince people, right? Because if you know somebody who's, let's say they're afraid of flying, and you give them the data, well, you're much less likely to die in a plane crash than you are crossing the road, right? And that doesn't make them feel all that much more comfortable getting in the plane and flying away. So it's not the data that you need to give them. You need to give them some other kind of emotional support. I remember one time I was flying between Buffalo, New York, and New York City, and the lady sitting next to me was really afraid of flying. I didn't want to give her data, but I offered to hold her hand, and she was she liked that a lot. She thought that was very, very nice of me to do. So one of the things about this data, and I think that we've gone over the kind of the way the data has been used and the increased precision of the data, but we haven't really talked about how it helps us to tell stories and to enlist new kind of participants in our efforts to do different things about managing water and land differently. So I want to give you just a couple of examples, mostly because I know Jeff's work really well. I don't really yet know the work of the other team, but I will, right? Because they're in Cambridge, right next door to us. But anyway, so when one of the things that the Chesapeake Conservancy did when they were trying to clean up the Chesapeake is they increased the resolution of the pictures they had of the Chesapeake watershed from 30 meters to 1 meter, which is 900 times better resolution. And what does that really actually mean, though? And even more, what they did was they merged LiDAR data, which is planes flying around with lasers that kind of map the landscape, and they merged LiDAR data over this image of land cover in the area. And then they actually made that data accessible on handheld devices that you can carry around with you in the field, right? So, but what they ended up doing, one of the interesting stories is how they were actually able to enlist the agricultural community actively in efforts to clean up the Chesapeake. Now, one of the things we learned here in Arizona, we've learned in other places, is there's a lot of natural antagonism between the environmental community, between the development community, between the agricultural community. And it's really true when you talk about water, because the agricultural community always feels like they're pilloried at the water table because they use so much of the water, right? But in the case of cleaning up the Chesapeake, the agricultural community was being pilloried because the agricultural community was responsible for a lot of the runoff, which had nutrients and other kinds of sediments and pollutants that were killing off oysters and destroying the water quality in the Chesapeake. But with 30 meter resolution data, they were running around and they're telling farmers to plant 30 meter wide riparian buffers to prevent the flow of nutrients from their fields into tributaries of the Susquehanna or something else into the Chesapeake. And we heard from Paul Boucher yesterday. He knows what a riparian buffer is. I don't think he wants to plant one 30 meters wide over the length of a river to kind of protect the river. But with 1 meter resolution data, they were actually able to say, wait a minute, we can actually track the flow of water across this landscape, and we can tell you with some precision where it would be the best place to interrupt this flow to keep it from flowing into the stream and eventually flowing into the Chesapeake. And oddly enough, when they went out with these handheld devices and they started talking to farmers, the farmers were eager participants in actually helping to clean up the Chesapeake. And they said, oh, I can plant a 1 meter wide buffer over here, no problem. Or I can put a retention pond there, no problem. And I'm actually interested in what you can tell me about my own fields, because it can give me even more information about what to plant based on where it's wet, where it's not wet. And they actually became partners. And by the way, they wanted to clean up the Chesapeake. They weren't opposed to a clean Chesapeake. They were just opposed to having the finger pointed at them as being only the problem and not the solution. But the solution was something that was so out of reach for them that they couldn't really participate in a meaningful way, and they could only live in some level of antagonism until the right kind of story with pictures was able to then give them the right kind of information at the right time, and it changed the entire kind of sociology of cleaning up the Chesapeake. All right, so then we come to Arizona. And in Arizona, the city of Tucson was really interested in understanding with some precision like what's going on in their land, because they wanted to think about a bunch of things, including stormwater management. Because one of the things that, even if this is a dry landscape, sometimes it's not very dry at all, and flash floods kill a lot of people in the West. And so they asked these guys to come out and see if they could use the same technology to give a 1 meter resolution map, understand the flow of water over landscape, and then start to think about what they could do to do better water management. The city of Tucson and and Pima County helped them to train the software so they could decide what they were seeing in these 80 shades of beige you have here if you fly over, whether or not they're looking at somebody's rooftop, a road, or just some sand or mountaintop. And they trained it, but what they ended up doing was, for the first time, they were able to give Maricopa County an accurate count of every house that was in a watershed. That was in a wash, and so basically for emergency planning now, all of a sudden, they didn't have to go around and try to figure out, well, if we get a flash flood, is this thing in danger? They could actually just look at this thing on a handheld and say, oh my God, for the first time we know where the problems might be, and now we can figure out remedial strategies to make this work better, right? So these are just two examples, but and Jeff can give you others about talking about crop selection in the Verde, right? Does growing hops for a brewery increase water use and evapotranspiration versus growing barley or growing alfalfa, right? And these are all things that actually everybody might want to know. But what it does is it builds new coalitions, and it gives you a new element to tell the stories in ways that become not so accusatory, but become more informative, right? And that's where data matters, because, you know, as everybody says, everything is data, but data isn't everything. But what you do with it, and certainly what storytellers do with it, is the major thing that we're here for, because we want to give you ammunition that can help you to kind of inform people about some of these really complicated and complex arrangements, like how water and land kind of interact in the West.
Thank you.
That's it for me.
Great. Well, I'll start out with a few questions, but please don't be shy and come on down and ask your own questions. So I'd like to hear from Jeff and Jesse about whether there have been any cases of journalists actually using your technology and these approaches, and if not, how you might envision journalists and how you see it as a potential tool for reporters.
You want to go first? Yeah.
So to date, we have not worked with any journalists yet, but we do actually have a free version of our work in which you can upload data, and we try to make it really easy to be able to understand what you're seeing and pull in some satellite imagery to tell that story over time. And I think that's what's the most exciting. And for us, as you mentioned, in working with these farmers that are keen on better management practices that have a larger impact on the landscape, any way that we can surface that work and use that to show how this can be done in other places is of great interest.
Yeah, we've actually had a number of journalists reach out to us looking at, mostly in the Chesapeake, but issues like flooding. If any of you heard about the story of Ellicott City, it's just kind of west of Baltimore, north of DC, had 200-year floods within 3 years that just decimated a historic downtown. It was an old mill town that the river was put underground. When you get a lot of rain, it doesn't go underground anymore. So just ripping floodwaters through Main Street. Looking at quantifying the changes over the last 20 years of new developments going into the headwaters coming down to it, and kind of say, how has that increase in impervious surfaces caused flashier storms? So even, storms are getting stronger, but also just how fast that water is conveyed through the system down to, the downtown is really important. So just being able to visualize, a lot of people, similar to what Max said, everyone said, immediately the issue is all of this new development going in, and what we're able to actually show was that probably wasn't the whole story. That there was new development that had gone in, but it wasn't as much as everyone thought that it was. It was only about 10% of the watershed had increased over the last 20 years, and really looking at kind of the strength of storms and the intensity of storms and the duration. A lot more rain in a much shorter time is probably driving some of those issues more. The other aspect is looking at climate change and its impacts. We did some work with a journalist for The Atlantic looking at saltwater intrusion on Maryland's eastern shore and looking at how rising sea levels are causing issues not from flooding but actually hitting kind of the groundwater table on agricultural lands, and being able to track where you have some farmers whose fields are literally disappearing. The productivity of the fields are disappearing. The fields are still physically there, but that saltwater intrusion in the groundwater table is making it so they can no longer grow crops. And what we're able to do is show, again, over the last 10, 15 years, year after year, you can see kind of these salted areas expanding in the crop, and be able to visually watch. I made an animated GIF of the imagery over the last 10 years, and you can see every year it grows a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. It was just a really powerful complement to that journalist's interviews and stories, and talking with this farmer whose family had been there for the last 400 years farming this land, of kind of what does that look like. So it really does provide a powerful narrative, and I think looking at it from both our work and Jesse's work is that change over time. The reality is the landscape is not static as much as we want it to be, and that change over time is really what's such a big part of the story, is to be able to say how are changing conditions, how is new development, how is changing water patterns changing how we interact with the land, and increasingly with climate change it's happening faster and faster and faster. And you can't really ignore that change.
Great, thank you. So speaking of change and climate change, one question that I have is, how do you deal with the fact that the baseline for so many things is changing because of climate change, and it's very difficult to define what is quote-unquote normal? For something like snowpack, you might look at the last 30 years, but is that really what we would call normal or average? How does the climate change impacts play into your work, and how do you deal with them?
Here it is. So a lot of the physical-based models of being able to understand and predict stream flow for reservoir operations and stream flow management are based in static points in time of we calibrated the model for this particular event or this history or these types of event or wet years, dry years. And our ability to be able to say, well, we can calibrate that model throughout the change over the last several years, several decades, rather than one point in time gives way to understanding the changing conditions that are having an impact on how water availability. And I think, yeah, the difference in a static model versus an evolutionary model.
And one important thing is the extent to which climate change is accelerating over the last 3-4 decades. And one of the good things is that even though we don't have the highest resolution stuff, we've got kind of a moving picture of viewing the planet from space for about 35, 40 years. And so we can track things like the receding glaciers and other things that otherwise would be really hard to do, or you'd have to go out there and take your pictures every year and figure it out. So I think there's whether or not it's a new normal, whether or not you're establishing a new baseline, the ability to tell a longitudinal story can at least give you kind of an idea of trends. And like the author at dinner last night was talking about, also give us the ability to kind of project forward trends and say, maybe this is a trend we want to interrupt, right?
Yeah, two of the things that I've seen the most is looking at the ability to process more data more quickly. Especially the work that Upstream and Jesse's talking about. You can experiment more. You can do those scenario plans where previously for a watershed scale model, you might do it, you might do your big run of that model once every 5 years. And you may do little tweaks and updates to it, but because the data processing was so intense, you were really limited in terms of how frequently you could update that model with the base data sets that went into that model. And I think that paradigm is changing completely, where you're creating more dynamic living models, where you can update it on a monthly basis, a weekly basis, a daily basis, to be able to say how this is changing. The other side I would say is really the resolution. Is that high resolution data makes a really big impact, especially in the Chesapeake. That's there's a lot of low-lying lands, wetland migration, wetland loss, kind of sea level rise, is where you see a lot of those impacts. And a lot of those impacts are happening over 30, 40 years. So that year-to-year change is so small, trying to measure that year-to-year change with the 30-meter data, you have to have really, really big change for it to show up. And what we're starting to see is some of those trends earlier. What are those warning signs earlier where, for wetland loss, it typically isn't from the outside in. It almost becomes like Swiss cheese, where you have holes in the middle of it that expand out as the water table comes out. And that just doesn't show up on that 30-meter data, but with the 1-meter data, you can start to see that much earlier to be able to see where those warning signs are.
The last thing I'll add to that, and I really don't want to take it too technical, so please stop me if I am, but our work in understanding stream flow is that we are looking at every single basin across the U.S. and understanding those patterns of change. And so if it hasn't happened in this landscape, but we've seen similar patterns there, we can use, it's called transfer learning, of observing those changes and being able to then predict and forecast what might happen in this basin, given if the similar conditions in another landscape. And we're doing that on an hourly basis, 0 to 10-day forecasting for reservoir operations as well. So it blows my mind.
Great, we have a question?
Yeah, this is really cool stuff. Okay, so you can do satellite imagery down to 1 square meter over a large piece of land. I'm in Southern California, which is suburban on one hand. We've got these rich kind of rural-ish areas like Malibu that completely burned in the Woolsey fire. Would I be able to use this kind of technology to say, look at these wealthy areas of Malibu that burned and, make some conclusions about whether they had done the kind of brush clearance that is recommended? At the same time, would I be able to go to a neighborhood like Altadena, which had a very lush tree cover, but which has been trimmed to, the trunk, terribly unsightly trims by the utility companies to reduce the fire danger, which we all know is part of, climate change. Is that the sort of thing I could be able to do?
Yeah, so what we didn't get too much into is all the different types of information that the satellites are extracting. So it's not only visually what you can see, but there's a number of other characteristics that you can extract from that. And so being able, residual dry matter, for example, and understanding that proportion across and being able to manage that more proactively, and also retrospectively and understanding what those conditions were that led to the fire, that then led to impacts in the stream, that led to landslides and flooding. Visualizing that arc and narrative is very powerful and definitely possible.
And I might be able to do like a map animation over, say, 30 years and said, here, Malibu, you forgot to trim your trees.
We got to rake the trees.
But
Rake the forest.
That's right, rake the forest.
It's important to know that data, that 1 meter data, is not free. Right, and so this is a big kind of concern, a big
Does
fact
my
about.
county have it, and can I access it through a Public Records Act request?
Probably not. It's not. Your county doesn't own it. It's collected by proprietary satellites owned by other companies. And,
Depends on the data set.
but it depends on the data. Yeah.
So we need to find a benefactor to make it available.
Or you hire a B Corp who's going to do it cheaply for
We're
you.
journalism, we don't spend money. People give us things for free for the public,
Yeah, public good, right?
There, but several states do LiDAR or different flights and make that publicly available, so it depends on the area.
Yeah,
But it
I've
is
been thinking about
there.
this after the Woolsey fire, and I did find some data sets, but then I ran into that kind of barrier
Yeah,
of having to pay.
yeah. I mean, there's definitely data sets that could do what you want that are publicly available that go back maybe 10 years. The challenge is the records that go back 30, 40 years are typically at the more moderate resolution, 30-meter resolution. That's going to be, you could still get some metrics in terms of, overall tree canopy, stuff like that from that 30-meter data, but you're not necessarily going to get to that kind of tree-specific data. But you most likely could go back at least to 2005, 2007 without trouble with freely available data sets.
One of the ways that the Chesapeake put, as far as I'm concerned, put their database on steroids was they actually went to the counties that are all part of the Chesapeake watershed, and they're able to get the assessors maps, which have parcel by parcel maps of every parcel that's owned, with all the dimensions of the parcels and all the defining characteristics, the buildings on the parcels, who owns the parcel, and they can then overlay that land use map on top of this map of water flow. And so now they have a really fuller picture, and they're connecting the water to the land in an important way, because now you know who to talk to if you want to do something on the land, or if you're detecting a problem, a point source or non-point source pollutant that you see, you can track flowing into the Chesapeake, you know where to go, right? And so, as it turns out, and this is one of those issues about the proprietary nature of data, that county data is all public record. But as it turns out, we've got 3,100 or so counties in the United States. A lot of counties don't want to give it to you. And so because they're actually providing a service to the counties voluntarily gave it to them. But if you want to get access to that data yourself, you have to go through proprietary sources who've been now paying the counties a lot of money to give that data, and then they're cleaning it up and they're offering it back up to the public to use. And the people who generally use it are like real estate developers who want to get all the real estate information in an area. To look at the entire U.S. in those maps with some of those data providers could cost you as much as $250,000
A year.
a year, right? It's not, and so one of my ambitions working with the Chesapeake and others was to see if we could do what they did in the Chesapeake in the basin. And it was predicated on maybe a naive idea that I had, which was if we could actually get a full picture of how water flows over the basin, who owns what, and all that, we could begin to use that to tell the story of what's going on in the basin. And we talked to Jim about producing a semi-annual or some kind of periodic state of the basin report, which would talk about what's going on, right? But we also thought that if we had that information, we could use it as a predicate for a civil conversation across different constituents, different stakeholders, to talk about how we might collectively manage water differently in this watershed. Because as you know, renegotiating the law of the river and all these other things is absolutely impossible. But it's really impossible unless you get people to sit down at the table and have a civil conversation. So, I mean, it might be pie in the sky, but at least with some reason to bring people together and to tell a story, you might be able to then get people to think a little bit differently about how they might work together, right?
So the resolution of this technology is pretty incredible, and I'm wondering if you have run into concerns about privacy and having so much information that it makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, that was honestly one of our biggest concerns. So we released our first Chesapeake Bay-wide high-resolution data set in December 2016, and we were prepared for massive blowback from the agricultural community of, your big brother, you're spying on my land, how dare you have this information about what's going on. And as Max said, the agricultural community has actually come out as some of the biggest supporters of having that data because it matches up with their understanding of the landscape. They're more confident in the models that they're getting a fair shake out of kind of what's going on because they can look at it, see their landscape represented, know that that's what management is based off of. But they also see a lot of benefit to themselves. We've taken a lot of care to, we do have, as Mac mentioned, the parcel information with landowner information, but we don't put anything publicly available out with landowner information, all of that, if it's not behind a password. Some of our partners do have access to that, but we don't want to create a witch hunt, to be able to say, you're the problem, in the Chesapeake, or you're the problem in the Colorado. But really framing it more as opportunities. It's prioritization, it's not targeting. You're talking about opportunities, not the problems. And knock on wood, we haven't had that blowback that we were anticipating. People haven't had that concern. I think part of it is everyone's so used to looking at Google Maps and being able to zoom in on Street View and looking in your front window. It's kind of creepy when you think about it, but people are accustomed to seeing that resolution and that detail, and for them, they're happier that their land is accurately being represented in the models, and that kind of outweighs the privacy concerns. And that's the Chesapeake experience. It may be completely different in the Colorado. There's a whole different set of issues and history out here.
Actually, they're friendlier out west than they are in the east. So,
Any thoughts about privacy?
Yeah, I think just to add to that is all of our work is, we are not the persons that are working directly with the farmers, but rather working with the organizations that have those longstanding relationships that can then offer incentives or help with the implementation of those different practices rather than accusatory in any capacity. And I think just adding to what Jeff said, that's the main distinction and really important framework to be working within across any landscape.
We're trying to find common solutions. It's not everything everywhere. It's saying how can we create a tailored solution for your property that's going to achieve the environmental outcome that we want while minimizing impact to operations, minimizing cost. And I think there's an appreciation that it's not, you're the enemy, you need to do everything and solve all the problems, but, meeting somewhere in the middle.
Questions?
Stu Fineglass. I wanted to bring up another side of data, and that's from the municipal side and water meters. And right now, historically, our level of data has been 1 read a month, and the customer's level of data has been 1 read a month. Now smart meters are being installed where easily you get 1 reading an hour. So tremendous influx of data where you can customize on a short period of time to get 1 reading every 10 seconds. And so this brings up a whole another level of data to water users. And of course you have interfaces that are being built for the water users where they can really learn how they're using water at a municipal level and industrial level and can affect their practices. I also wanted to mention that many cities are using the data from Digital Globe or whatever satellite data we've got and joining it with our LiDAR data. And we can also get access to that data for customers for their own yards.
Right.
And they can look at am I overwatering? Am I, what am I doing? And it's opening up a whole nother side for us, so much so that we're getting a little bombarded with data and where are we going to put all this data?
Yep.
But it's really useful on the customer side as well, on the municipal, industrial, commercial side.
Yep.
The other thing I wanted to mention is especially for reporters, is data isn't all data. So for instance, I would get calls about per capita water use. Well, it brings me back to in New Mexico at one time. I saw a presentation on their per capita water use. They have a 7-tab spreadsheet to calculate per capita water use. You want to see this per capita or that per capita or that per capita, just to make sure that you're looking at apples to apples. You're looking at indoor residential, you're looking at total per capita, you're looking at total residential. There's so many per capitas that data can easily be confused and tell maybe a wrong story.
I was at a conference, a UN data forum, and one of the panels we had on it was on data journalism. And it was mostly focused on how journalists can do a better job of representing data to make it more accessible, turning data into different kind of pictures or cartoons and all that. But one of the real concerns there was that you really need to understand a little bit about data if you're going to start reporting about it. And sometimes you can't just report single numbers, what you call measures of central tendency. You have to talk about dispersion, you have to talk about variation, you have to talk about other things that are really kind of key, because otherwise you can lead people to spurious conclusions. And when I used to teach statistics, I used to use as one of my textbooks How to Lie with Statistics, because there's a lot of ways to do it, and one of the ways to do it is to just focus on measures of central tendency. Right?
There's another book, How to Lie with Maps. And
Yeah, so there you go.
So, we're trained as journalists. I heard a decent amount of conversation this morning about not wanting to target people, not wanting to be accusatory of people causing environmental problems. And we, as journalists, are trying to think about accountability. And sometimes it does involve accusing people of causing environmental problems. And I'd like to know, is there a way to reconcile these two seemingly conflicting things? What's the line between finger pointing and collaboration, or the bound, or, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say from our perspective, we have taken a lot of efforts to not point the finger, just because we are trying to work with agricultural communities. We need to be out there, we need to have that beneficial relationship. That doesn't mean that we can't help you get the information to tell the story of, from the journalistic, the reporting side, the accountability. I think, part of what we're working on is getting people used to that level of understanding, that level of detail, to be able to help them understand that people will be able to take this, be able to use it, to increase the accountability, and to help them understand how to better manage their land from that perspective. We look at it a little bit as try to get people up and rolling and working in the right direction voluntarily. We do have the big stick of the total maximum daily load in the Chesapeake Bay. That is a regulatory hammer that comes down in 2025 if they're not meeting their water quality. So they're getting a lot of pressure to be able to go that way. What we have found is that we haven't necessarily had to go on that more directed or targeted reach, because people want to do the right thing, they just don't know where to work. So we can just say, here, point them in the right direction, and people are going to go from there. But I think more and more as the deadlines get closer, you will start to have that. How do you have that more targeted outreach and kind of a little bit more forceful conversation to be able to say, here's where our issues really are.
I think the only thing to add to that from our perspective is you can measure 15 million things in the field on a one-time basis to tell a particular story, but the ability to monitor that over time and more frequently, especially as deadlines are coming in, are we yielding the expected benefits that we hope to see? If not, why? How can we retool to then see that and have the accountability on a more frequent basis, rather than one time a year, and then now, for the last year you weren't doing the right thing. Now we go the next year, and maybe we can go yearly, but oftentimes it's much more static than that.
And sometimes more precision actually will give a remedy that's not as punitive as one might think, right? And so just like not having to plant 30-meter riparian buffers and you're getting away with 3 or 1 meter riparian buffers is sometimes good. And sometimes, you know, like if you're looking at water quality in lakes and you realize that you know it's coming from septic systems, but you just don't know which ones, right? Now, if you can start to track backwards and figure out which ones, then you might even be able to help whatever it is, the communities or landowners that are actually the contributors to this water quality that maybe they didn't even know it, right? And what you don't do is you don't just pass, you know, by fiat some blanket thing that just now bans all, you know, septic tanks of certain kind of characteristic, because maybe that's not the problem, right?
We do have a very tangible example right now that we're working on with the county, actually where we're based. They've had a no net loss tree canopy policy in place for a number of years, and in particular looking at what's called the critical area within 1,000 feet of the shoreline. Strict regulations on development, and you know, there's a county review board that can grant exemptions. They're supposed to pay into a fee and lieu fund to be able to do restoration elsewhere. And that fee and lieu fund had grown to about $7 million, and they had accounting at the project by project basis, but they never looked at it spatially. You know, everything was tabular, everything was in spreadsheets. So what we're able to do is actually do a time series from 2007 to 2013, 2013 to 2017, to be able to count down to individual trees, where have you seen that loss, and to begin to actually quantify what that change has been, both from permitted sources, so where you have those permanent applications, as well as the big thing that was missed was residents can clear up to 2,500 square feet of tree canopy on their property without a permit. And it was kind of one of those death by 1,000 cuts, where you just had a lot of that little loss that ended up being something like 1,500 acres in the county of tree canopy loss that was just unaccounted for anywhere. It had never been tracked, it had never been mapped. And now we're working with the county to kind of revise some of their policies now that they have this information, to kind of say, how do we look at this more proactively, where you might not need a permit, but we want to keep track so we don't have too much of that tree canopy loss in a sensitive watershed, and be able to look at that. And you know, a lot of it is having this level of detail and information. People make different decisions, and sometimes it's just you need to get that information in front of them in a format that they can digest. And they're willing to make the decision, they just didn't know before.
Great. Next question, please.
So I just am wrapping up about 2 years of studying the development and implementation of decision support tools and open water data in California. And one of the interesting things that came from this is that the academic literature says that the water management space is kind of like a graveyard of well-intentioned decision support tools that were, you know, a cool widget was created and then people used it for a year and then it just went on the shelf. So this is a real challenge. Like, how do you develop data products, management tools that people actually adopt and then sustain the use of them to improve their decision making over time? I'm just wondering if you guys could talk about maybe how have you thought about that, and what kind of practices or maybe things do you do to sort of ensure that the end user actually benefits in the long term after, like, you know, somebody gets paid to make the widget. Thanks.
Yes, so we kind of have an internal mantra of faster, better, easier. That anything we build in terms of these decision support tools has to allow someone to either do their job faster, do their job better, or make their job easier. And ideally all three, but if you're not hitting at least one of those, it's going to be an impediment. They're just going to do it the old way because it's faster, better, easier for them to do it that way. So we spend a lot of time working with partners to understand what their existing workflow is and try to build whatever that decision support tool where it integrates as seamlessly as possible. So it's not a second thought, oh, I've got to go use this platform to calculate some number. It's just a part of their daily workflow, and they can't imagine doing their job otherwise. I think the other aspect of it that's somewhat challenging, and I think Upstream is doing a better job of it than we are, is looking at it not as a one-time fee to build that widget, but looking at it as a subscription, as a yearly maintenance fee, as whatever it is. I think one of the biggest challenges is that everyone looks at these widgets as something that you build and you deploy, and then it's good forever. These things take an insane amount of maintenance to update data sets and make sure they're current, to update to the latest technology. When, you know, Google Chrome updates something on their platform, all of a sudden everything you've built breaks because they changed one letter in one thing that you're counting on. And you really need to have that regular maintenance and support. Otherwise, as soon as it breaks, it's done. Because that person then just loses faith. They go back to whatever they were doing. So you really need to build that cost and maintenance into that platform. And hopefully it's an easy cost-benefit analysis for whoever that local municipality is, because, you know, yeah, it might cost $5,000 a year, but I'm saving $20,000 a year in staff costs. And having us and helping us document those savings is really important.
And what I would add to that too is if it's put on the shelf, it's probably a static assessment that's no longer relevant to my current day decision making. And so inherent in all of our work is making sure that it is up to date, that it is still relevant, and that it is still applicable. And I think the other piece that I might not have touched on a lot is the ability to, in our work, is to scale a local effort, right? So if we work a lot with TNC in California on a particular bird returns program in which they're paying rice farmers to keep the floods irrigated on the shoulder seasons. And they could not physically scale their program because they could not drive to every other field. And so in using our work and working in close collaboration with them, they're able to then add hundreds of more landowners to their programs because they don't have to physically go to monitor it. They can still maintain that relationship with them, but aren't bound in that respect. And I think that.
So I'll give you a couple more thoughts. One is that when you introduce a new tool, there's generally kind of this learning curve that people have to go through. And one of the things that we do at Lincoln is we try to find ways to train people to use new tools, particularly if we develop the tools. But one of the things about local government is there's a lot of turnover. And one of the reasons things end up on shelves is because somebody leaves and then the next person just never got trained to use that tool. And they go, all right, screw it, I'll just do something else, right? And so being able to maintain local government capacity is something that we're now also focusing on, because we understand that in order for the public sector to work, they actually have to be skilled up. The other thing is that we need journalists to be the bad cops in this regard, because once you have a tool and what you're asking people to monitor something, right, the journalists might be the ones that go around and catch people who aren't doing their jobs, right? And you know, we need to be friends with those people because they need to adopt the tools. We need somebody else to be the bad cops and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, what's going on here? And so if the journalists are kind of aware of and monitoring the use of the tools, they can also become part of the enforcement mechanism, which is why journalism was called the fourth estate way back when, right? Back when journalism was relevant, right? Just to be provocative.
Am I supposed to follow that?
Tough act to follow, yeah.
So I'm curious about residential property and how these tools might be brought to bear. So in two growth scenarios, we'll call one Minneapolis, where potentially the density is going to increase in the future by a great deal, residential density. And the other one, let's call it Los Angeles or San Francisco, where the density is probably not going to increase in most of the city. So how would we start to look at TMDLs or measuring the impact of the water quality for either of those growth scenarios using these tools? How could we start to bring that to bear at scale? Because there is no scale larger than residential property ownership.
Yeah, so a lot of our tools are really designed to work in that more densely developed landscape where that 30-meter data breaks down. You can look at that LiDAR elevation, that basically laser altimetry, to be able to figure out how water is moving across someone's backyard, or to calculate the amount of roof area that you have and be able to say this is what the benefit of rain barrels would be or rain gardens would be, or looking at kind of how you can have that micro-sited best management practice or stormwater practice. We did a really cool project with the District of Columbia where we assessed every storm drain that they have across the district to calculate the drainage area coming to it and quantify which ones would be best suited for environmental retrofits, like curb cuts and retention basins, to basically say this is how you can most effectively reduce the amount of water going into your combined sewer outflows that were a really big issue. And so stuff like that, it has the resolution to be able to kind of get into that very fine scale. And also because we're starting to have multiple timelines, being able to look at and quantify kind of the real numbers of development in terms of amount of impervious surface, amount of tree canopy in someone's backyard, lawns, driveways, and be able to forecast that out to give better estimates of what new development is going to be looking like in 2025, 2050. to be able to say, you know, and this is a project that we did with the Chesapeake Bay program, modeled out development across the Chesapeake Bay for 2025 and 2050, and we're actually working now on a 2025 baseline for nutrient and sediment estimations. And as a city, you know, continues to develop, they can actually reduce where they're going to be in 2025 by making smart land use decisions. And for the first time, conservation is actually credited as a best management practice, avoiding loads in places that have the highest likelihood to be developed and have the highest water quality impacts. You can get credit for that now, where before the only way you could get credit under the model was by doing restoration. So as perverse as that was, you know, how do you keep those ecosystems intact? So I think, you know, being able to identify those very fine scale opportunities, but also being able to do more precise modeling of what development's going to look like, you know, in like a Minneapolis that's going to grow, being able to better say what's it going to look like in the future at that very fine resolution.
So we're, this doesn't involve remote sensing, but we've been developing a whole set of scenario planning tools that are really, very usefully deployed for being able to understand different development scenarios, for example, if you can densify. And we've been merging, we're hoping to merge that with capital accounting, where we're trying to get localities to do a better job of mapping their current infrastructure. And one of the important things to keep in mind is that density sounds good in theory, but very often in practice it actually requires a whole different kind of underground infrastructure to support it. And very often cities haven't done a good job of being able to keep track of what that infrastructure is.
Yep.
And so I used to live in New York City, and if you go to Brooklyn now, they added 30,000 units of housing around Atlantic Yards. You can't move around Atlantic Yards because they've absolutely maxed out, you know, infrastructure that most people take for granted, like sidewalks and streets and subways, right? And now, you know, the subway cars that arrive in Manhattan from Brooklyn are already full, and people in lower Manhattan can't get on because now all of a sudden the infrastructure is maxed out, and nobody asks those questions when they're approving all that additional density, which in theory would be a good thing, but maybe we need to think about the other investments that have to go in tandem with that to make it work. That's not particularly about water, but the same thing applies to wastewater, to water delivery, to all the other things that you need to support density. And we think that we could be doing a lot better job of keeping that data and updating that data and using it as a planning tool.
Next question?
Yeah, in the context of ag to urban transfers, are your products enabling or likely to enable land speculation? Because it sounds like you can only really use this if you got a lot of money, or do you think you're pushing back against people who are inflating historic use for fallowing?
I think there's a lot of opportunities to improve accountability, which is going to allow, and if I'm understanding the question correctly, looking at transfer of water rights, you know, being able to kind of quantify what is my historic use been, what are my water rights, how can I also demonstrate if I'm making reductions, kind of what the transferability may be to a downstream or a more urban use. You know, I think looking at existing models for a lot of this, there's too much squishiness to it to be able to have the trust that actions are actually resulting in the losses, and it's not just a shell game of moving pieces around. In the Chesapeake, it's been a lot more on water quality trading, looking at nutrient trading. I think there's a lot of similarities across, and that's, you know, honestly where I'm most familiar. But what we've really seen is the higher resolution data is leading to an increased trust in the system to be able to say that these projects are actually generating kind of the credits that could be used elsewhere, and that it's not just working on a game of averages, but the averages blow up and you're actually seeing that decrease in water quality, or, you know, in the Colorado River case, an increase in consumption where the reductions aren't actually occurring, but the increased uptake is.
So in our experience, the speculators are way ahead in the data game, and they don't have to wait for us to develop public sector tools to inform their decisions. So they already know, right? And they know because they pay for the data. It's like the people who can pay $250,000 to get every parcel in the United States data, you know, they're using it for a variety of reasons, and they have all very good quants working for them, trying to figure out what the next kind of investment should be. And incidentally, I've personally been tracking a lot of the flow of private equity into water. This is global flow, and it's amazing. I mean, the global flow of private equity into water funds now has been increasing by double digits a year for the last like 20 years. So everybody knows there's money in water, right? Katie Lincoln calls it the new oil, you know, maybe that's what it is. But whatever it is, these guys already know, right? And they're willing to pay a lot of money for 1 meter resolution data, and they have a lot of good quants doing all sorts of stuff, because they are also trying to, you know, trade 1 nanosecond quicker than the other guy, right? So.
Doesn't look like we have any other questions, so we're almost at the end of our time. So just want to wrap up here, and I'd like folks to maybe look forward into the future in terms of where the technology is going. And if you might imagine if we were here 10 years from now and doing the same panel, what you would be talking about and how the technology is advanced. I mean, it's quite incredible about the resolution, for example. I could almost envision a 1 centimeter resolution and people reading over my shoulder from space, but
They already have 30 centimeters.
okay. So where do you see the field going? Where do you see the innovation in the years ahead?
Okay, the mic had to think for a second. I think what I'm most excited about is the ability to inform more proactive planning and the tools to be able to do that in a quantifiable way and being able to monitor those outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, is more not reactive management. If I saw something was happening for the last year, but I didn't know it was happening, but now you can inform those strategies and changing on a quicker basis.
I see a lot of movement more towards integrated systems management, where I think we still do a lot of modeling system by system, and those models don't necessarily talk to each other or inform each other. A lot of that is just the complexity and the data crunching that's required for each model independently, let alone getting them all talking to each other. I think we're definitely moving towards the direction, you know, both with Moore's law in terms of processing capacity doubling every 18 months has been holding true even when people thought it couldn't anymore, they find new advances. But also looking at kind of cloud computing, distributed computing, where you can just handle massive data sets really quickly. I think you're going to get into these more kind of dynamic integrated systems where every piece, you know, when one person changes here, you can see all of kind of the downstream impacts and how it impacts just both that sector as well as other sectors. And it's just going to be a much different way of managing.
You reminded me of one other thing. I'm sorry. So one of the other really exciting aspects is being able to understand the distribution of habitat for biodiversity within the agricultural landscape as well, rather than seeing those as two siloed areas, and being able then to inform how that integration of ecosystems management can complement each other.
So I'll be Pollyannish, and I'll say that I see a future in which all of this data is part of the public realm, part of the public commons, and the trend that we have to interrupt to do that is to make sure that we're not allowing private interests to basically privatize the data commons, which has been going on. I just give you a cautionary tale because this terrified people at the meeting that happened. So the CEO of the company that makes the Roomba vacuum cleaners was at a public conference, and he actually said on stage that they've been centrally collecting data from the Roombas, and now they have maps of the inside of everybody's house that owns a Roomba, right? And when he said it, everybody did kind of read it. They're like, what? And then he said, but they haven't been able to figure out how to monetize that data. Right? And so, you know, monetizing data is one of those things. It's a term that we need to be tracking, right? Because, you know, we have to be really, really careful about the extent to which we let private concerns control the data. And every county assessor is required to maintain these property records, right? But they're not necessarily required to make them standardized, or not necessarily required to give them to us freely. We can go to the county records office and pull them out of the files if we want to, but a lot of them are already machine readable, but they're not just giving them up, right? So we need to do our best job of making sure that 25 years from now, we're talking about how well we're doing because we know what everybody else knows, because the data is available to everybody.
Great. Well, I want to thank Jeff, Mac, and just want to thank our panelists, Jeff, Mac, and Jesse, for sharing their insights, and thank you, the audience, for some great questions.